Hey everyone, I noticed a couple of problems or opportunities with my beginner students in ASP.NET Core, where I see these common mistakes or things that they're kind of struggling with early on in this .NET Core class, MVC. And the first thing that I want to kind of hit on is how to do CRUD operations on a SQL database using Entity Framework asynchronous methods. You can write code both asynchronously or synchronous, use the synchronous version of those methods. And I want to kind of show off Entity Framework's async methods. And so that's going to be one way that you can kind of upgrade the code that you're writing is in choosing these asynchronous methods, which are just better all around. And they will be doing CRUD operations, create, read, update, delete, on a SQL database. And so to kind of show that here, I got Visual Studio opened up and you can kind of see I've got this restaurant database, and in there I've got a table called entrees. And if I view those entrees, you could just kind of see I've got a table of not the most complex data set in the world, but nonetheless we've got entrees. Those entrees have IDs, names, and prices. Pretty simple. And the web application that we're building is going to be able to read those entrees. And so you can kind of see here, I'm putting those entrees into Bootstrap cards. We can do, of course, adding new entrees. We can edit those entrees. We can delete those entrees. And again, this is all using Entity Framework asynchronous methods. The next thing I want to point out that will, again, help my students is how to do some custom routing. And so we're going to be modifying the URL, okay, to make these more user-friendly, following some best practices, using what's called a slug. A slug is just I'm kind of curious where the name came from, but it's basically a text description up in the URL. So you notice when I go to delete my pizza, you see some information about what you're deleting in the URL, so that kind of is a user-friendly feature. If I go to delete my spring salad, notice it's hyphenated instead of the spaces. And so how to make URLs more friendly by providing slugs, also making everything lowercase. Notice my URLs are all lowercased. That is not how it works out of the box, so how to do that, and trailing slashes. Again, basically modifying these routes. And if I could just go to /entrees, again, that's not a default route. Normally this would be like /entrees/list. So you can kind of shorten the URL. And so CRUD operations using async methods, various things, improving our routing. And I want to show how to create one view that has multiple purposes. I want to point this out. Now notice when I go to add entree, notice the controls on the page. You know, we just have an entree name, text box, we got a floating label there in Bootstrap, and a price with a floating label for the price. Well, the add entree controls are, well, pretty similar to the edit entree controls. It's just a couple of text boxes. So how do we keep our code dry? Obviously, that's one of those coding principles to don't repeat yourself and minimize the repetition of code on that view. We're going to create one view to handle both operations, adding and editing. So you don't have to have different views that basically have the same controls on them. So when I go to edit an entree, or if I go to add an entree, we're able to use the same view. So that's the task at hand. Those are the three things that I'm going to cover, and let's get into it. So again, I had the demo application there to kind of show off what we will be building. Pick your entity, pick your thing. We're going to be creating this from scratch using Visual Studio Community 2022. So download, install it, choose the ASP.NET install package, right? So that's really all you need is Visual Studio Community, and check that box on the installer to have ASP.NET Core MVC. When you do that, you'll be able to create a new project. And from the templates, notice I filter my templates to C# and web. You can choose ASP.NET Core Web App Model View Controller will be the template that I'm working with. Lots of different templates, lots of different options. We'll cover some different templates in this class. But for now, this is what we're working with. And pick your topic. And so what are you going to be working with? What data, what entity are you going to be storing in a database? For me, I'll just go ahead and create a movie application. And so keeping track of movies, movie titles, like I said, it doesn't matter a ton what your entity is. This is more about, you know, learning the tools that you have available to you. So this will be a movie app. This is my movie web app. And select where on your hard drive you want it to go. Choose this little tilde and again, these little ellipsis, I should say. Browse and put where you want it. My last location was on my desktop folder, a couple subfolders, that's fine. I'm going to choose all the default options here and click create. Now the first thing to do is to install Entity Framework. And so Entity Framework is not installed by default on ASP.NET Core. There are a couple of packages to bring in off of the NuGet Package Manager. So I'm going to go to Tools, NuGet Package Manager, and use the GUI. And if I browse for Microsoft Entity Framework Core Tools, we're going to bring that in. I'm going to select my whole project and install it. So let's bring in some Entity Framework tools. And we need to also bring in Microsoft Entity Framework Core SQL Server. Obviously, we're working with a database, so we need the tools and the database package itself. We get those green check marks, you should be good. Now, additionally, you can expand dependency packages, and you could see that we brought both of those in. Then a couple of configuration settings to get this to work. We need to enable what's called dependency injection inside of this program CS. I'll do that second. But we need to bring in a connection string in our app settings. And so the connection string just points to the database, you know, kind of provides some credentials to get into the database. And so I will copy and paste this. You know, if you're following this in a video on YouTube, I am going to recommend that you just be very careful as you type this out. There are a lot of places for typos, but I'm going to highlight everything that I just pasted in, everything from that comma down to that closing curly. But I'm going to make a couple changes. Obviously, this is a connection string, but it's not a restaurant connection string. This is a movie. So the name of my connection string is movie CS. I think that makes sense to me. So we're naming our connection string movie CS, and the name of my database is right here. Instead of calling it restaurant DB, I'll call it movie DB. Again, if you're following online, you're gonna have to manually type this out. Be forewarned, there's lots of places for typos. So if you get to a point where something's not working, good chance that you have a typo in your connection string, because there's a lot of room for mistakes here. All right, so once you have a connection string, we need to enable what's called dependency injection. And so this basically helps us make a connection to the database from our C# files, from our controllers. And so I'm going to go into my program CS. Let me kind of pin this back down and make room here. And after the builder services add controllers with views, after line 4, I'm going to paste this in. Again, a couple of room for mistakes here, but as I paste this in, notice my method here is get connection string. Well, it's not called restaurant CS. I called it movie CS. So number one, we have to change that. In these quotes, we have to point it at the correct connection string, movie CS, and we need a context file. This is our C# file that we have to create. We don't have this file, so I'm getting the red squiggly. And if I show potential fixes, I'm not sure that this is going to put it in the right place. So I'm not going to, I want to put this in my models, and I'm not sure that it's going to put it in my models folder. Alternatively, you could put it in like a data folder, but I'm just going to right click, add, and add a class. I'm going to name this movie context. And so that should make the red squiggly go away, but I need to inherit from the right file, db context. In order to inherit from this file, I need to bring in Entity Framework Core, and that should at least, now I'm gonna maybe movie context, have to add a using statement up at the top to resolve that error. Okay, so we modified our app settings to point to a database called MovieDB and gave it a connection string name. We enabled what's called dependency injection. Again, that's going to allow us from our controllers to connect into our database. And so this context file, this is going to be where we actually name our table, because we don't have a database yet. We're going to actually create the database, create the table, so we get to name the table in here, and we get to implement some seed data. And so this context file, there is a kind of a neat newer syntax for, let me show a line of code here. This is actually pretty neat. Okay, so this line right here, line 7, if you know C#, you know this is a constructor. And this constructor has one parameter, one input parameter, that is type DB context options, which is a generic movie context. Nonetheless, there's one variable here that comes in, and all you do is you pass those options up to the parent. The parent is the DB context. So you take in some options and you pass those options up to the parent, and that's what line 7 does. Thankfully, you can use this feature called a primary a primary constructor, and it condenses this syntax. This is pretty neat. Watch this. Show potential fixes, use primary constructor. Notice how it moved everything up into the method header, or the class header, right? It's not a method, it's a class. This is our class header. Now our movie context class, you can kind of see it takes in to the constructor here, passes that up to the parent, that variable up to the parent, and that's a condensed version how to write that, which is pretty neat. Again, this is called a primary constructor, which nonetheless, we will use that. Now, why line 7 is erroring out? See, this says, hey, I'm going to have a database set of type movie, singular, called movies, plural. This is our database table, right? Our table is a collection of movies, so it makes sense to call them movies. Each row is a movie. Well, we don't have a class called movie, right? So we need to define our class called movie. And now that we have a movie, now that type is recognized. So what do we want to track about a movie? By the way, I get asked this question, what code assistance tool am I using? I am using GitHub Copilot. If you are a student, you can get a GitHub student package. If you're a student at Rankin, you can get a GitHub student package, and you get a trial access to Copilot. Feel free. Okay, so we have an ID, which this is going to be our primary key on our movies table. So this will be auto incrementing 1, 2, 3, 4, and we'll seed it with some data. We got a title, and we can have a release date, genre. Okay. The number of fields and what those fields are. I'm just going to have a title and a price, just to keep it condensed. Okay. Now I am going to make my price nullable, because that'll actually help down the road with some error messages that we have. So our decimals can be nullable, and I'll add in a little validation here. Required error message, and we'll just say price, movie price is required. Okay, and I'll do kind of the same thing with the title, saying a movie title is required. And notice on line 1, we have to bring in this data annotation namespace in order for these attributes to work with these properties, the required attributes. Okay, so our movies are pretty simple as far as the class structure is concerned. That's not what we're focusing on here. And again, making that price nullable will help me with error messages down the road. Now, let's go ahead and seed some data, right? So our database is going to have some dummy movies. And again, use this at your own peril. The very standard advice from any teacher is going to be make sure you understand the code that it's writing for you, but I can explain it. Let me bring in a few more movies. If I say new movie, put a comma there. I just want a few movies. Don't really care what the movies are, although it is picking some pretty popular movies. Okay, these are auto-implemented properties back here on these movies. These are called auto-implemented properties. And what that allows us to do is use these object initializers, where you can use the auto-implemented properties that when you create an instance of a movie to call the set blocks. This is calling the set block of ID. This is the set block of title, the set block of price. So auto-implemented properties allow these object initializers. It's a crazy, what they call syntactic sugar, really condensed syntax for getting the job done. So this model builder entity of type movie has data. This is, populating our table with this data. And then what? So now we're actually ready to create the database. And the way that we do that is with what's called a migration. And so this is, again, Entity Framework. And when it comes to Entity Framework, there's a code-first approach. This is a code-first approach because we're starting by creating a C# class of type movie. And so we're coding our C# classes first. There's another approach that we will get to called database first approach, which is a very cool way of you already have a database that exists, you can extract the classes out of it. But that's not what we're doing here. We're doing Entity Framework code first. We're seeding some data. And in order to do this, we need to create the database. Well, anytime you're either creating a database or modifying a database, you have what's called a migration. So I'm going to add a migration and call it initial DB creation. init is most commonly used in these tutorials. You just say add migration init. But I want you to understand what we're actually doing is creating our database here. When we're creating our database, of course, we're creating our tables. And so you run this process, and if you did everything right, no errors. But this is a common point of failure. It's easy to make a small mistake. But nonetheless, you can kind of see here, we're creating a table. I would encourage you to look at the C# that's created. This creating a table. The table's called movie. That's got 3 columns. What are the SQL data types? Nvarchar and decimals. And then we're inserting, these different objects into our. So there's really 2 operations. We're creating a table and we're inserting some data. And then if you reverse this migration, you basically delete that table. And so, creating a migration, it's kind of the first step. And then to run your migrations, you say update database. And if this works, it'll create our database, it'll create our table, and insert the data into our table. So again, our database should be named MovieDB. I'm going to open up my SQL Server Object Explorer that can be found off of the View menu, View, SQL Server Object Explorer. If your tab is missing, that's where it is. And I'm going to expand SQL Server. The instance of SQL Server here I have is local DB. Notice we're working with the version local DB right here in our connection string. So there's local DB. There's MovieDB. This is the database that we just created. And if I go to tables, and there's my movies, I can view my data, and there it is. So kind of just getting this all set up is to this point in the video, and now obviously we get to start working in MVC. So let me go ahead and close these tabs. I'll reopen them as needed. Of course, I could just done a close all. And so where to start? Well, if I boot up my application, we just have a very standard templated home page. And, probably when I want to start this up, I'm just going to look at all my entrees. And I could just modify, this is the home controller. Like what this is actually routing to is /home/index. So what's behind the scenes here is some default routing. It's the home controller, the index view is what's happening behind the scenes. And I could modify that controller and the index method to do something different. However, I'm going to start by creating a movie controller. And so I'm going to start maybe in controllers, and I've got a home controller. And feel free, I'm going to delete what I'm. You can just leave that there. I could delete some of this, but let's add a controller. I'm going to add an empty controller, and I'm going to add a movie controller. Okay, so it's movie singular, which is important. All these conventions are important. Capital M, capital C, to get this all to play nice. And this is my index method of my movie controller. And so what I need to do is I need to bring in that context file that is movie context so that I can actually hit my database and query some data and update data. And so to start by doing that, I'm going to make a private read-only field called my movie context. And notice it's when I hit tab here, it's going to bring in my models folder in the using statement called _context. Again, this context variable here will allow me to make that connection to the database. It'll query the data. Now, in order to initialize this field, right, we declare the field here, but we need to initialize it. We're going to bring in a constructor, public. Oh, I'm doing this in the wrong place. Excuse me. Line 6 needs to happen inside of the class. That's why I was getting an error. So now I've got this field, and now I can have the constructor. This is that dependency injection without, notice when I have a movie controller, into the movie controller is coming a movie context type, an identifier of context. Line 11, you can do this because of that dependency injection. Right? We're injecting the context file into our controller, and then we initialize the field, which is underscore context. And I'm going to rename this method to my list. I'm going to list all of my movies here. And I mentioned making these asynchronous. So this is going to be the first place where I change my method to type async and action result. So you change a couple of things, okay? The first thing, when you make these methods asynchronous, again, this is going to allow us to call the database in an asynchronous method, allows our apps to just operate faster, operate more efficiently. And so obviously the keyword async, the return data type becomes a task type with a generic action result. Before, this was just action result. That was the non-asynchronous version or the synchronous version. So I will go ahead and say var movies. Now check this out. We need to await. Now my two movies async. I saw this error. Let me remember what I'm doing wrong. I've seen this before, and I can troubleshoot it live, or I'm going to pause. I'm just going to pause. It's funny, I should have just troubleshot it live because it's a pretty simple fix, bringing in Entity Framework Core. And now we can return those movies to the view. Okay. So here we are now hitting the database using asynchronous methods. And now we need to write a view. So as we've learned, our views need subfolders. So create a folder. My controller is called movie. So the folder needs to be named movie. The action is called list. So the view needs to be called list. Again, all these conventions are very specific. And let's viewbag.title equals list movies. And so get the title in there, and rebuild and apply, and then you should be able to right click in view in browser. Whoop, let me right click my view in browser and at least get the title up here. Okay, and notice it's the /movie/list, and there's my list of my movies, and so the title's coming up. And so where to go from here? I mentioned custom routing. Well, it's pretty easy to change this route. And so what comes of, how do you make a good URL? Well, this is fine. /movie/list is a fine URL. It could be shortened. And so just to show that, how can you shorten that URL? Well, /movies would make you think of a movie list. We use the term movie list, but most people just say, these are my movies. And so /movies would be a more user-friendly way of putting that in a URL. So the way that we're going to do that is by bringing in the route attribute and just say movies. Now this is going to break some things, but let's manually type /movies. Now notice when I go to /movies, now we get my list of movies. So it's not really broke. We just don't have any other way of getting there besides typing in that in. I'm not a fan of doing that. So maybe on my home controller, instead of returning to the view, I'm just going to redirect to movies, and you could say /movies. And so now on my home controller, if I go to my home controller index method, remember this is the default, this is the home page. All it does is kind of redirect to movies. This isn't a perfect, I don't love it, but it allows me to do what I want it to do. And so there's my list of movies, there's /movies. We are modifying our URL. Probably your home page, it's going to have a splash landing page, welcome to my site, yada, yada, yada. For the purpose of what I'm doing here, I'm just going to redirect. Okay, now I have a list of movies, and what I want to do with my list of movies in my view, again, this should be sending these movies over. I need to strongly type my model. And so essentially, I've got a lowercase model, which is a list of type movie. Now, a list is a C# collection that implements IEnumerable. And so another way of writing a list of type movie is, saying anything that implements IEnumerable, right? So this is actually just a little bit more flexible way of saying this is a list of movies. IEnumerable. All IEnumerable means is you can enumerate over it. You can put it inside of a for loop and loop over it. Nonetheless, you could say list of movie. You don't need the whole namespace either. You should just be able to say IEnumerable type movie. And then what? Say a little H1, my list of movies. And then I'm going to put each movie in a card. And, maybe like 3 cards per row. And so just a little bit of styling, a little bit of flexbox kind of thing. Let me bring this over. So you can do I'm going to go into, let's go into my CSS here. Site CSS, I'm kind of just delete what's in there. And I'm going to write, this I didn't have it embedded, I'm just going to put it here. Okay, my flex container, I'm going to say, flex wrap should wrap and justify content, space around, 30% width and margin. So every, basically you're going to get rows of 3 bootstrap cards per row, and it's going to be in a, in a flex box. And so if I come back here, I need a flex container. I need a parent div class of flex container. And then I'm going to loop through. This is kind of close, but it's not what for each var movie in my model. Okay, so I don't have an image. If I go to my CSS, I've got a bootstrap class of card and flex container. Let me, instead of reinventing the wheel, here's what I did on my for each. And I'm going to comment out these links right now because I don't have the links ready to go. And obviously So again, so here inside of my loop, inside of every iteration of my loop, I create a bootstrap card. Each card has a card body, a card title, and card text. So these are bootstrap classes, and I just need to refactor because these aren't entrees in my new one. This is movie dot title and movie dot price. And so now if I boot this up, I should be getting movies, titles, and prices inside of a div where class of container main. Here's my flex container. There we go. This is my flex box. And then inside of my flex box, I have a bunch of cards that are 30% width. And because it's wrapping, they're just going to the next row. So we've got the read operations. And now we get the other ones to work on. Obviously, create. We are reading, updating, and deleting. But remembering that add and edit are going to use the same view. So that's what's coming up next. So of those operations, the easier one of the three is delete. And because, you know, add and edit are using the same view, that makes it a little bit more complex. So I'm going to do delete next. And so we're going to start by, in our movie controller, adding a method for delete. Now there's actually two methods that I'm going to create for delete. I'm going to create a get, because I want to, you know, create an HTML page to kind of prompt the user, like, are you sure you want to delete this? And so I'm public async task iaction result, and this will be delete. Now you're going to have to accept an ID. Now, let me kind of talk about the routing by convention. So here, when I'm looking at the default route, I kind of have a default pattern that says, okay, look at your controller first, then look at your action, and then we've got this route parameter, or a route variable. So this is a variable that is optionally passed in. And so if I do /movie/delete/3, that says, you know, that you can pass that into your URLs, and then that can be received by this delete method. That ID, this is a route parameter, because this matches this method can receive the ID of the movie to delete. And then what do? Well, then you look up that movie by its ID. It's not amazing because you have to kind of hit the database again. And so, you know, if you want to avoid that, you could maybe have a post here on the list to delete, because this is a get method. This is HTTP get. It's implicit here. And you could just wire it in so you don't have to go to a different page. But if you go to a different page, you know, got to hit the database again. You do that by receiving the ID into this method and looking up var movie to delete, and then you hit your context movies table, find asynchronous, and then you remove, right? We're going to say underscore, we're going to await this, underscore context remove, Oh, by the way, this is, yeah, context, remove, movie to delete. Oh, this is, goodness. All you do, I'm sorry, we're going to return view movie to delete. We're actually going to, we look up the movie and then we send that movie to the view. It's on the post when we actually remove the movie. I was looking at the post. Okay, so this is just on the get. We look up the movie, we send that movie to the view. We got to create the view. So this is under movie, right click, add a view. Again, the name has to match the name of the method. So delete is the name of our method, delete is the name of our view. Let's do a view bag title equals now what is our model? Let's define our model. Lowercase m is type movie. So this will say delete the movie. H1, are you sure you want to delete at model.title question mark? And here's a form, ASP action. So we're going to say delete action. This is a post method. And couple of things here. We're going to hide the ID field in a hidden field. If you don't pass the ID, in many cases it doesn't work. I don't know that I need that here. Let me see. Yeah, I think I do. So I'm gonna hide the ID. Here's a button to submit. Here's a submit button. It's a red submit button. And if they cancel, I'm gonna send you to the ASP action of the home controller. ASP controller is home. So if you cancel, you just go back to your list of movies. And a couple different button colors. If I view this in a browser, of course, crash because I don't have a movie. You can't just skip straight to it. So let's refresh. Now my list of movies needs a delete button. So if I go back to my list of movies, let's bring back in my delete button. Comment out. And here I need to define the ID that's going into this link. So notice here, this is directing me to the delete action, but I'm going to pass the link, which is the movie ID, which is lowercase movie.id. I don't have a slug yet, so and I'll bring that in next. Okay, so here is our delete button. If I boot this up, okay, I'm going to delete Schindler's List. Are you sure you want to delete Schindler's List? I'm going to hit cancel first. Brings us back home. If I hit delete, okay, good. So my post isn't working. I didn't write a post, so I got to finish this up. So back to my movie controller. Here's my get for my delete and a post, and then we're going to do a slug HTTP post, and let's do a public async task. Let's see, delete. We accept a movie, so the view is strongly typed. It has a movie. We're going to send that movie object into our delete method, and we're just going to remove it. We're going to save changes and redirect to an action. I'm just going to redirect to movies. So now I've written a post, I've written a get. We'll do the slug next. Delete Schindler's List. Are you sure you want to delete? Let me see. Okay, so here, I'm curious if it actually deleted it. It did. And so my redirect didn't do something right. It did. It hit my post, and let me look at that error message one more time. Here's what I'm going to do differently. It's another way that I redirected. So my list method has a route of movies, and that code didn't work for me. So what I did is redirect to action, and then you use the name of lists. And that will be another way of sending me to the name of the list, which is the movies. So you got to kind of go down the rabbit hole a little bit there. So let's boot that up. Redirecting worked from the home controller, but anyways, if I delete Pulp Fiction, now I'll go to delete now. Okay, now it's not crashing there. So I can delete movies. Cool. However, I want this to say, I want that slug, I want this URL to be a little bit more friendly, even though it's really pretty clear what movie we're deleting here. So let's put a slug up in the URL, and there's a couple parts to this. It starts in the class itself. And I'm going to create a public string slug. And, okay, couple things. A slug is just a text, that is the title. But what we're doing here is if there's a title, if title is kind of truthy, if you will, if title is truthy, then let's replace the spaces with hyphens and make it all lowercase. However, if title isn't there, if it's null or an empty string, then you don't replace anything. So that's what this conditional operator does. This null conditional operator is kind of like an if-else. If title is truthy, then run this replace method and lowercase it. Otherwise, if it's not, don't do that. So we're going to start by adding a slug as a property. It's a read-only property that just returns the title in, after running those methods on the title property. Okay, so that's what the slug, it's kind of the first step. The next step, and this is actually interesting, where we modify our route. Now notice here our pattern takes a controller, an action, an optional ID. I'm going to add an optional slug. Okay, again, this is the name of a variable that we can pass into our URLs. Okay, so this modifies our default routes to include an optional slug. We defined what that slug is in our class, and now we can actually create a link that uses just how we use this ID variable right here. Like we could say whatever variable you have ASP route You could have name. You could say slug. You could say cheeseburger. These are just variable names, right? This ASP route ID, that's a variable, the ID variable. ASP route slug equals, and now we have access to a movie.slug. So that will put the slug in the anchor tag for our delete method. And so let's take a look-see. The first thing to do is inspect the URL, make sure that. So now if you kind of look, I'm hovering over the button, the delete button in the lower left-hand corner of my screen, you can see localhost movie delete 1, The Shawshank Redemption. I click it, now we get the slug up in the URL. Okay, a little bit better. I also said I want to lowercase the whole thing, the whole URL, and add a trailing slash. Again, lowercase is just a little bit easier on the eyes. That's not the case here. So let's go back to our program CS. Let's open up program CS, and after the DB context, here's another way of bringing in those options to our routing. We have to our routing, we're going to add these options, which are lowercase URLs to true and appending trailing slashes to true. And so now when I click delete, we got lowercase URLs, we got a trailing slash at the end, we've got a slug. So delete the movie ID of 1, The Shawshank Redemption. If you are being honest about it, do you need the ID of 1 in the URL? Probably not. But it does kind of help. It does help from the get method to accept the ID from the URL. So with some thought, I could probably shorten that URL maybe and find a way to pass the whole movie in. Nonetheless, that's the current working state of the delete method. So now we can list movies, we can delete movies. Back to our tasks at hand, we got a couple more operations with CRUD. We've got our slugs. So it really leads us to this creating one view that has multi-purpose. What are those multi-purpose? Well, like I showed at the beginning, updating and creating have the same controls on the view. So let's close all but this. And let's do create first. And so what are we doing? We're creating movies, and we're going to create one action method, if you will, to do both operations. And so the method name will be add edit. It'll be a get, because there will be another post, just like delete. There's a get and a post. HTTP get public async task I action result. We're going to call this add edit. It accepts an ID, very similar to our delete. And I'm going to copy and paste a little bit of code here and change this underscore context movies. Okay. So this one method needs to account for both operations, adding new movies and editing movies. And so if the URL, if there's no ID, then you're doing an add operations. If you're editing a movie, that movie will have an ID. So notice the first thing I do is I check to see if the ID is 0. If the ID is 0, then I create a piece of data to send to the view, and it's just my operation that I'm going to send is add, and then what I can do with that is I can put that in the title of the page of the view, and I can put it in the heading of the page, so it can say like add movie, or in this case it would say edit movie, right? So this is just a piece of text to be used based on if it's a new movie. We're obviously doing an add, and then I send an empty constructor to the view. It's basically a movie with no title, a movie with no price. Otherwise, this is an edit operation. I look up the movie by its ID, and then I send, and I call that entree. Obviously, I'll rename that to movie. I look up the movie, and I send the movie that I find out of the database to the view. Okay, so this is my add edit, and under movie, I now need to create a view called add edit. Now, what I'm adding or editing is a movie, so let's put a strongly typed view. Let's set our view bag title equal to, and you'll notice here, I can say view bag dot operation movie. And so this will say add movie, I'll get my quotes right here. Put the $sign on the outside. Okay, and put get my syntax right. So I can change the title, and the title will be add movie or edit movie based on what I set the operation back in the controller. So again, yeah, I'm just sending a piece of a string text from the controller to the view using this view bag property, I believe it's called, view bag. It's not a dictionary, I don't believe. Yeah, it's a dynamic dictionary. It gets the dynamic view data dictionary. So it's a dynamic property is what they refer to it as. Okay, and kind of the same thing here. I'll throw in the operation. I'll say at view bag operation. So again, add movie or edit movie. And let's go back to my listing of movies, and underneath here I'll create an anchor. ASP action is add edit, and this will say add new movie, and I'll add some bootstrap classes of button, you know, whatever. Button info will be the styling of my button. So let's just boot this up and see if my link is working. Movie, add edit. Okay, add movie. So this is working as we've coded it so far. Notice I've got add, I got an extra plus. It should just say add movie up in my title. So if I go here, get rid of the plus, add movie, add movie. Let's fill in the rest of this. Okay, I'm going to now have a form. This will lead to my post, right? So I need an add edit post. It doesn't exist yet. And I'm going to copy and paste my markup. So pause the video as needed. Now I like these floating labels. So these are bootstrap floating labels. And I gotta change my fields to be the right, properties for title and price. So the ID will be blank on a new movie, obviously, but it'll be generated automatically by the database when we go to insert one. So let's go to add new movie, floating labels. It shouldn't say entree name, it should say movie name and movie price. The Matrix is expensive. Okay, I don't have the post, so let's make the post. Now, we need to, on the post, validate some data because we can't be putting in, bad data into our database. And so, again, I'm going to public async add edit movie. I'm going to paste this in refactor entree as movie lowercase d. I will explain this very quickly once I fixed add movie ID underscore context update movie. Okay. Go ahead and stop it from running. So just like in the get, we need to determine if it's an add or edit operation. We need to determine if it's an add or edit on the post. The way you do that is by looking at the ID. If the ID comes in from the view as 0, if there's no movie ID from the view, then we know it's an add. So here you've got the ternary question mark that sets the operation to either add or edit based on this being true or false. So ternary operator sets the operation to either add or edit. We could do a very similar thing up top. This is very similar. Two different ways of solving the same problem. Okay, so we're setting the operation. We're checking if the model state is valid. So if there is valid data for our add operation and the ID is 0, then we add a movie. So if the required fields are there, then the model state is valid, and there's no movie ID, then we add the movie. Otherwise, if there is an ID and the model state is valid, then we update the movie. Then we then we save the changes and redirect to name of list, which we know is /movies. Otherwise, if the model state is not valid, then you just send the movie back to the view and you get the error messages. In either case, you get the error messages if it's an add or an edit. Now I want to point this span tag out. This span tag is our ASP validation for the title and the ASP validation for the price. So we should get, if we go to add movies and we click save, we get movie titles required, movie price is required. Because of that if else in our controller, checking if the model state is valid. It's not valid because the fields aren't there, so we send the empty movie back to the view and give it some error messages. However, if I say my movie is The Matrix 2, now we should see The Matrix 2 is $2,000. And The Matrix 3 was so bad it was 0.50 cents. Okay. All right. So we got adding. We got deleting. Let's delete matrix 3. No big deal. We could have a cancel button there, and that would make sense. But nonetheless, the last thing to do is an edit operation. Oh, by the way, deleting. Okay, still has our slug there. Let's bring our edit button back. So on my list, here's my anchor tag that points me to add edit. It's going to send into the add edit method an ID, so you can look up the movie, and the slug, so that can be used in the URL. And what's beautiful about the way that we constructed this is once you bring this link back, you test it, it's probably going to have a bug, but we already wrote the controller, we already wrote the view. If I click edit, if I take that out, the Shawshank Redemption, there you go. And so I do this fast because you're watching this from a recording, and hopefully you can pause as you go. Thank you if you made it all the way. I'm going to do one last check over this and make sure I didn't leave anything out. I don't think I did. We've got data validation. I should have put that in here, although the validation is not necessarily what anyone struggled with. If I delete, we can delete, create new. Create. Obviously we're reading. We can obviously update. And we can delete. We got CRUD operations using async methods. We've got custom routing, everything from /movies to putting in a slug to lowercase and URLs. We've got all that. And we kept the code dry. We reduced the amount of code that we had to write. And you saw that with the edit movie. Like once I did it for the add operation, like it was already done for edit. So that kind of sped things up a little bit. Covered all the topics. Code is operational. Hope you enjoyed this tutorial. Let me know. Thank you. Bye.